Most people never even try the thing that they want to do. So they say that their goal is to save up forever so that one day they can, just get on a sailboat and sail all day.
Mm-hmm.
And they've never spent more than 3 consecutive days on a boat. It's like, take 3 consecutive days, take a month to try the thing that you're working your whole life to do.
Hello and welcome to the Lewis and Kyle show. Today, me and Lewis are going to be talking about the 5 books we prepared today. I have 5, Lewis has 5. We're going to get right into it. Lewis, why don't you start off with your first book?
Okay, so the first book I'm going to talk about is Deep Work by Cal Newport. People that know me know I talk about that book a lot. It's been very influential for me in a lot of ways. I read it in the spring of my freshman year of college. It was recommended to me by the Recommended Books for College Students on Thomas Frank's website, College Info Geek. The book is about focus. It's about the importance of cultivating high-quality attention and being able to concentrate deeply and for long, sustained periods of time on one specific task. And it goes into the importance of that from a personal perspective in terms of he's not making necessarily any claims about whether this is good for society or not. I mean, he kind of does, but that's not the point of the book. The point is, if you get good at concentrating for a long amount of time, you'll see massive individual advantages. There are 3 skills that are important for the modern economy. One of them is the ability to master hard things quickly. And the best way to be able to do that is to work deeply. You have to be able to have long, uninterrupted periods of focus on whatever you're studying to be able to learn it quickly, especially if it's something that's difficult.
I've actually read the book as well.
You read my copy.
I did. But what ways does he say you can get better at being focused for long, uninterrupted periods of time?
That's a good question, Kyle. He goes into a couple of specific practices he recommends for doing it. It's not something that you just practice or get better at deep work by trying to do more deep work. You actually have to make changes to your everyday life in order to improve the skill. And one of the most important ways to do that is to limit the amount of distracting behavior you participate in, or at least to take control of it. His big recommendation is deleting social media or moderating it in a substantial way.
That's something that you followed for a while, right?
Right. You know the answer.
I do know the answer. However, recently you're taking a different path, and I think that's interesting and something that you should talk about.
Okay, so chapter 4 of the book is called Quit Social Media. It's a very persuasive argument against social media. Cal Newport, extremely successful author, professor, has a very large following on the internet, never had social media. His reason for never creating Facebook when he was in college is that he had his own internet company in college, and he was jealous, and he was like, the smart guy ain't crap. I'm at Dartmouth, he's at Harvard, I'm better than him, whatever. And so he didn't want to start it, kind of out of a personal jealousy type thing. And then he saw the way it was affecting the people who had it, and he never decided to get into it. He asks you to think about what are the most meaningful things in your life, which for most people are pretty similar, right? Meaningful work, meaningful relationships, doing things that are interesting to you, having higher quality relationships with a fewer amounts of people. And if those are your core values, then you ask yourself, does using social media contribute or take away from those core values? And does it do so in a way that brings more advantages to them than it does harms? He presents a list of advantages and a list of harms, and his argument is, based on those things, it might make sense for you to not use social media. However, his argument is more nuanced than that, and he doesn't say social media is wrong for every person to use. Anyway, so I'd followed that advice for a while because I wanted to be more distraction-free in college, to be able to better do my work, and to, with the people I wanted to stay in touch with, have my only option be phone calls and text messages and emails or whatever, because there's something that's much more intimate about interacting with people in that way, because it shows, I chose to communicate with you via this phone call, or I chose to communicate with you via this text message, whereas they post something, you happen to see it, you happen to comment on it. It doesn't show that purposefulness.
I think something that's interesting about that is the way that people use social media. When they get comments and they get likes on their different pieces of content, it's more about bolstering that piece of content than it is about the connection between you and that other person. I feel like if I get a comment from you, let's say on an Instagram post, then I'm not thinking about you commenting. I'm thinking about how that reflects outwardly. Exactly. So I think that plays into the reason that those connections on social media don't feel as real. I mean, I think you could probably get it out of the DM function of them, but I totally agree that calling and text messages seem and exist to be more personal.
Exactly. If your only option to keep in touch with people is taking it into your own hands to do so, that makes a difference. Anyway, so the reason I started reintegrating some social media is originally I wanted to join a Facebook group for this book I read and for this challenge I was doing. So I made an account again so I could be a part of those things. And I decided to keep it because there are a lot of people I've met through different experiences, and especially with international people, it's just logistically easier to be able to have one platform where you can reach out to all those people and try to keep track of contacting them in different ways. So I decided to keep it, and Facebook's never been something I've gone sucked into, especially if you don't download the mobile apps, especially if you trace the history of these platforms. It wasn't until they went on mobile, when Facebook first started its mobile app, that its usage really became...
Yeah.
And I have a Google Chrome plugin called Newsfeed Eradicator that when you go on Facebook, you don't see the newsfeed. You just see your notifications, which, if you're using it right, should be only the types of notifications you've chosen to receive, which should be basically only things that directly mention you. Otherwise, they're taking control of you and manipulating your thoughts, or direct messages or friend requests. So in that way, it's really just another form of a database for people. And if you want to look up a specific person and see what's going on with them, you can search them on there. But it's not letting the newsfeed dictate what you're in control of. So deep work's very important. And that actually ties into something really interesting. That's a theme from another book I chose, if you don't mind me jumping ahead a little bit.
Absolutely.
I know it's okay,
Let's go for it.
4-Hour Workweek, right, by Tim Ferriss. It's kind of an obvious one. Everyone was expecting us to talk about that. But a big idea from that book is not about the entrepreneurship, but about managing your time, managing yourself chapters. He talks about controlling your inputs. He talks about the low information diet, choosing to consume less media for a lot of reasons. One, you don't need to consume it yourself in order to stay informed, because the people that actually watch the news are oftentimes, they only know the headlines and couldn't tell you any sort of level detail about whatever's going on beyond the 30-second soundbite of the story. So watching the news isn't even about learning. The connection with Facebook and not using your newsfeed is that it allows you to use Facebook in a way in which you're controlling what you see. When your usage of media is, let me go on the YouTube homepage and see what videos are recommended for me. Let me go on Facebook and see whatever happens to be in front of me. Let me go on the news and watch whatever happens to be playing. You're not choosing your inputs, and that is ceding autonomy about what you're thinking about, what your emotional state is, and I think that's a terrible thing to do. It's a problem a lot of people get sucked into, because you've lost control of what you think. So if the first thing you do in the morning is check your email, or the first thing you do is check Twitter, or the first thing you do is check Facebook, or the first thing you do is watch the news, you're letting other people decide what the first thing you think about will be. If instead you chose, to read like a devotional, I'm not saying a religious devotional, maybe just something like the Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday, where you just choose to expose yourself to something you know is good, or you choose to read a passage of a book that you know is great, you're choosing the direction for your day.
That kind of plays into one of my overarching theories, like about life, I guess. Just the fact that one decision leads to all your other decisions, and making one hard decision, like getting up and reading that devotional, makes the next good decision even easier, and the next even easier, and the next even easier.
You can make decisions that work for you or decisions that work against you. So it's really powerful if you approach a lot of situations with, how can I handle this in a way that will work for me?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? A couple big lessons from the 4-Hour Workweek, since that's on your list.
This book kind of redefined the way that I look at the world. My dad's an entrepreneur, and I've seen him his whole life work in different businesses and try and do different things. That book told me that it was possible to live a life outside of what people think is normal.
What do you define as normal?
Defines this group that is called the New Rich. And I think that he's now sad that he chose the New Rich as the way to describe it. But it's just people that understand that the world can be manipulated, and that you can take risks and be successful in the world without having to accept all the societal norms, like going to college, buying your first house, living in one place your whole life. Like, all these things that are good in theory just aren't completely necessary.
I think A good example of that, right, is mini retirements. Right.
Yeah, exactly. The idea of taking a 6 week or 6 month vacation 5 or 6 times throughout your life where you use the money that you've saved to live off of it in some of these different countries when you are young enough to really enjoy it.
I think you're underselling his best arguments for the mini retirement.
Well, you're the one that's been on them.
Exactly. So the
Yeah.
argument for the mini retirement is that people wait and save their entire lives for some arbitrary goal, right? And there are two big issues with kind of deferring gratification on something that you've never even experienced. First of all, for most people whose retirement is something simpler than their current situation, they could probably already attain some version of it in the present.
Hmm.
And the second, most people never even try the thing that they want to do. So they say that their goal is to, just get on a sailboat and sail all day.
Hmm.
And they've never spent more than like 3 consecutive days on a boat. It's like take 3 consecutive days, take a month to try the thing that you're working your whole life to do.
The grass isn't always green on the other side, and maybe it'd be good for you to just enjoy where you're at instead of working your whole life to get to some greater goal.
Yeah, I think that's a paradox though. If you follow up on the author, he lived out his idea of liberation, which is like the end of the book. Like, okay, so now you have all this free time and free money, so what are you going to do with it? And his answer is like travel the world, go to somewhere new and interesting all the time, even though that's kind of not what he ended up doing. And most people do that and enjoy it for like anywhere from 3 months to a year, and then they realize they're not building anything meaningful. They're just chasing highs, and they end up planting their roots somewhere and deciding that the grass is greener where you water it kind of thing. I've even kind of experienced that myself, living in Thailand for 3 to 4 months, visiting a new destination every weekend is awesome, but you're investing so much in relationships that you'll likely never continue. You're making new friends constantly, but very few of them will prosper into something more meaningful, and you're leaving behind the opportunity to actually build a community and have deeper, more fulfilling experiences and longer term benefits. I think a big paradigm shift from the book is the idea of acting on the world versus letting it act on you. And I think that's kind of a little quip to encapsulate what you're trying to say about how it made you rethink entrepreneurship as a possibility. I think there are two other important things I had for this book. The first one is challenging your basic assumptions. The limitations that everyone thinks that they have, right? Those are self-imposed. You're the only one telling yourself that it can't be done.
But it can't be done.
I mean, other people might be telling you that too. Headwinds in your life might be encouraging you to believe in things that limit yourself, but it takes some time
actually do it.
to like ask yourself, like, what are some of my assumptions about the working world, or some of my assumptions about making money? Okay, well, my assumption is the only way to make money is by having a job. If you call that into question and you ask yourself, okay, is that true? Does that hold up? The answer is all of a sudden no. You start considering alternate ways. And then the other point from that book is 80-20, right? That's the first time I was really exposed to 80-20.
The Pareto principle. I feel like I see that everywhere now.
Want to explain what it is real quick? 80-20?
The 80-20 principle is basically that you get 80% of your results from 20% of your work. And that holds true with most companies. Like, you get 80% of your revenue from 20% of your customers. So if you double down on the 20% of people that you're getting most of your benefit from, then increases your effectiveness and your bottom line at the end of the day. And that can be applied to many different things. Most of the time, it's actually not 20% and 80%. It's usually like 5%, 95%.
And that's why when we work out, we only do compounds for the most part. Compound exercises, you can get 80% of the results of someone spending 2 hours in the gym just by doing 5 sets of 5 heavy back squats, 5 sets of 5 heavy bench press, 5 sets of 5 deadlift, or whatever, 3 times a week. And that's a good discussion on the 4-hour work week, I think. Little intro teaser. What's your next book? Because I've kind of brought it up.
I guess I can go into Equity Happens.
What's that about?
It kind of explores one of my interests. I'm very interested in real estate as a investment vehicle, specifically investing in like multifamily apartment units and different types of real estate. And actually, the people who wrote Equity Happens are Robert Helms and Russell Gray. They're the people that run the longest running real estate podcast. They've been on since like 1994. The first half of it is a narrative story about 2 different people. One is like a middle manager at a company, and one is a janitor at that company. And they work together for 30 years side by side. And the middle manager always looks down on the other guy. But the whole time, the other guy is actually investing in real estate. And at the end of 20 years, the company gets dissolved and the middle manager has saved no money, doesn't know what he's going to do. He's got a car loan on his Mercedes and all this stuff. And he goes over to the janitor's house and it turns out it's a huge custom mansion. And, he's built this real estate portfolio over the course of his life. And then after that narrative piece, they get into a technical analysis of how to be the janitor. It's actually really funny in retrospect to look at it because this was published, I think, in 2006, right before the big crash.
Talk about challenging assumptions, right? Housing prices always go up.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what this book is about. They say you don't need to invest in cash flow because you can bet on appreciation. In most of their models, they either use 7% appreciation or 4% appreciation.
Okay.
4% is like uberly conservative for them. They're saying that that's almost impossible for it to be only 4% per year, which, you can see isn't true or hasn't been true. And it wasn't true immediately after this book came out. But it was my first introduction into the power of building wealth through real estate. It taught me a lot. And it drew up a passion in me that has been there for a long time about real estate, but channeled it more into the idea of actually being an investor and the idea that I can actually do it for myself.
That's awesome, Kyle. Is that your favorite real estate book or just the first one?
I think that you don't need to read very many real estate books. Like it's more of a field where if this was the only real estate book you ever read, you'd probably be fine. But I like different blogs. I like the bigger pockets, like forums. I prefer podcasts over books because usually it's different people that they bring in to talk about real estate investing and what they've done to be successful. Sam Zell's one of my heroes, I guess you could say, just because of his track record and how well he's done with being the grave dancer, as they call him.
What does that mean?
It means that he acts when other people are on the verge of bankruptcy, basically. Like he goes in and swoops up distressed properties. That's what he did in the 80s, and that's why he's been so successful, is when that savings and loan crisis happened in 1987, he had a ton of cash built up because he knew that something was coming. Okay. And he went out and purchased all these properties from sellers that couldn't hold on to their properties at a steep discount.
Crazy discounts.
Yeah, crazy discounts.
Yeah, he might be dusting off his dancing shoes then.
Indeed. But yeah.
Speaking of crises and benefiting from disorder, there's a book called Antifragile. The idea of Antifragile is that you benefit from disorder. Variability and randomness in unpredictable events are almost like that's the only certainty, right? Is uncertainty. And Antifragile is a mindset where you try to position yourself in all sorts of situations to actually benefit from that predictable variability, disorder, chaos. Most people think the opposite of fragile is robust, right? Because things that are fragile is glass. You drop it, it breaks. So the opposite of fragile is robust. Something that if something bad happens to it, it's resilient, it weathers the storm, it's very strong. But that's not the opposite. That's like the middle ground on a spectrum of fragility. The anti-fragile is something bad happens to it, or something you perceive as bad, or something not desirable per se actually makes things better off.
Some fat-tailed risk happens to it, and then it becomes better off, right? That's like
exactly. I mean, it's not possible really in most circumstances to benefit from every set of circumstances.
Uh-huh.
So the way Antifragile brings up investing, right, is something it calls a barbell strategy, which is totally carried by asymmetric risk profiles, where you put 90% of your investment in something that should almost, with certainty, not lose value, whether that's cash, money market, gold, things that the variability is extremely low. You put the majority of your portfolio in something that is extremely conservative, extremely safe, but the other 5 to 10% is in extremely risky things. Something that could go to zero, that's a real possibility, but it could also 1,000x. So whether that's putting 2% of your portfolio in like Ripple or IOTA, like some arbitrary cryptocurrency, or in an early stage startup, and that has a known downside because at worst you lose your principal, but at best it turns into something huge. And you can use those gains to either reinvest in your risk investments or in making the conservative part of your barbell bigger. And that's just the very, very, very beginning of what this book gets into.
Would you say that one side of the barbell should be in things only that will hold their value, or things that create income for you? Because the difference
depends on your risk tolerance, right? A little bit.
Okay. Yeah.
And it also depends on what things that produce income. So I think real estate could
I guess that's the obvious answer.
Yeah, it could play a role in the conservative part of the portfolio, right? If all of it is real estate, then you're exposed to massive downside risk, because it's possible for real estate to lose 50% overnight.
The reason I brought that up is because I was listening to a podcast earlier about real estate, and it was talking about the difference between speculation and, investing. And he said that speculation is where you risk your principal, and investing is where your principal is relatively safe and you have some not asymmetric upside, right?
Yeah, exactly. You want asymmetric upside, not asymmetric downside. Asymmetric downside is how you go bust. Nassim Taleb, former trader. Nassim Taleb deserves a podcast, and then another podcast, and then another podcast. Each one of his books deserves a series. Each chapter deserves a series. They're so dense. But what really makes him cool, he's very authentic. He has a lot of skin in the game. He stands by and carries out and lives out every one of his ideas. And that gives him a lot more credibility, which is something I think is true of all the books we've brought up so far, right? Cal Newport still doesn't have social media, still probably holed away in a dark room writing some computer code. Tim Ferriss more or less has had the same attitude towards the world since he wrote the 4-Hour Workweek.
He said that he increased his passive income by 20% in a month ago.
Yeah, his headlines still read the same after 10 years.
Exactly.
So these guys are very true to what their message is, and that makes them very attractive as authors. Let's jump to the next book. Kyle, what's your name?
Let's talk about Shoe Dog a little bit. Have you read Shoe Dog?
I have.
So Shoe Dog is the story of Phil Knight, the founder and I guess ex-CEO of Nike. It's his autobiography going from when he's 20 years old all the way through to the eventual IPO of Nike. It's just incredibly well written. We discover in the story that he read a lot of classics when he was younger and was a voracious reader. But basically we follow as he has a project at Stanford Business School where he writes about creating a shoe company using imported goods from Japan. And then he gets on a plane, goes to Japan. He did what everybody else would never do in that class. He actually went to Japan, followed his ideas and his passions, made it happen. And then, there's miles of story that I could outline for you about what happened. But what I got from it was just the relentlessness that he had to have in order to be successful in that world. It's something as simple as shoes, but he was, floating credit lines and sweating every day. And just you could see the torment that it put on him through his writing. And he still went for it. And today, we look at him as just some eccentric billionaire, but being able to see inside of his mind from the ages of 20 to 37 was really interesting for me.
Yeah, that's a pretty solid summary of the book. And I agree with your just that takeaway at the end of it of how interesting it is to label him today as an eccentric billionaire and say, oh, he's some genius, he's some talent. But he was very average or very relatable as a 20-year-old. He got his undergrad in accounting, became an accountant, was an accountant, had some side project idea from his MBA class, asked his dad for money so he could go travel the world, decided he wanted to started out in a relatively small, limited inventory type thing and just figured things out as he went. And you don't read the book and think this is some exceptional genius, this is some exceptional mind, this person's capable of things I'm not capable of, right? You don't get that impression from him, which makes it a very empowering book.
And he's very open about the amount of luck that he reveals his luck. He doesn't say straight out it's luck, but like one of the most interesting things about that book to me was his partnership with this guy named, I think it was Joe Johnson. It was a double J name, but he just randomly runs into this guy that was his classmate at Stanford, and the guy needed a job and he hired him, and it turns out that this guy is like extremely meticulous. He collected a customer list from everybody that he ever sold shoes to, and would correspond with them and send them discounts, and he just had like a computer in his brain basically. And the company simply would not have become what it is without Joe Johnson. And it all happened by chance. So, it's really interesting to look in retrospect and deem it as lucky or whatever you want to call it. But it happened, like, and it could happen to you, it could happen to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the next book, since on the theme of inspiring biographies, is Cant Hurt Me by David Goggins. It's a classic. David Goggins, he's one of those dudes you can't even describe.
I haven't read it, but
you're familiar with him, obviously.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with him.
Basically, his autobiography, co-written by Adam Skolnick, is the author. They do an audiobook. I've only listened to the audiobook, but I've listened to it twice all the way through. And I would actually recommend it because it's an experimental media where they do half podcast, half audiobook, where Adam Skolnick narrates the chapters, and then him and David do, 5 to 10 minute discussion of that chapter, podcast style, after every chapter, which is awesome. He goes through his entire life story from being a kid, getting beat by his father, not going to school and doing very poorly in school, almost failing high school, and then having to learn basically 4th grade to 11th grade in the matter of a couple of months, which is extremely interesting sidebar. The public education system is so messed up that that's possible. So he cheated from like 4th grade to 11th grade and then managed to pull himself together in a couple months of ultra learning, graduate high school, and then he wanted to go into the military, couldn't pass the military test. That's a whole other story, passing the ASVAB, how he studied for that. And then he gets into it, starts getting into the Air Force, being like a paratrooper, pararescue man. But for whatever reason, he either gets kicked out of that for medical reasons or honorable discharge because of medical, and just goes and becomes a cockroach sprayer at donut shops and these fast food restaurants. And he gains a ton of weight, starts weighing 300 pounds. And he was coming home one night and he saw an advertisement for the Navy SEALs. He decides, I'm going to be a Navy SEAL. So he calls as many recruiters as he can find. Everyone says no because he doesn't fit the height and weight requirements. Then one guy says, okay, if you can lose 100 pounds in 3 months, you'll meet the height and weight. And he finds a way to do it, and he becomes a Navy SEAL. And that's an incredible story about getting through Hell Week. And then actually as a Navy SEAL and the additional training, he's just an uncommon dude. And he talks about the mental toolkits he used to become who he is. He's very, again, same thing as Phil Knight, where his entire purpose is not, look at me, I'm David Goggins, I've done things no one else can do. His whole thing is, I'm like the least spectacular person ever. I was not smart at all. I was not athletic at all. I'm not gifted in any way. All that's interesting about me is that I've been a student of my mind for 10, 15 years. I've cataloged and created a couple, only like really 10 tricks for how to push yourself to do more. I just doubled down on every one of those simple tricks, and here's all the things I've done with it.
Can you give us a couple of those tricks?
Sure. So one's the accountability mirror. Another one's the cookie jar. The accountability mirror is basically putting sticky notes on your mirror that are your goals. It's the idea that every day you look at that mirror and ask yourself, and I think he talks to himself literally, in the mirror. It's David Goggins shouting at himself, you're fat, stop being fat, or you're not fast enough, get faster, or you're quitting too early, stop quitting. But he puts his goals up on his whiteboard on his sticky notes and is forced to confront them every day and ask himself if he's making progress towards them. So that's really powerful. The cookie jar is more of an in the moment type thing where he's on a long run and he's out of gas, but he digs into his cookie jar, which is this mental bank of motivational experiences he's aggregated of, okay, why would you quit now? Because think about how badass you were 5 years ago at this race. And it's how he accesses what he calls the sympathetic nervous system to pull up extra adrenaline in these different experiences. So those are just a couple. He talks about the dungeon, how he kind of psychs himself out and retreats into this world of loud music and noise cancellation when he's doing his pull-up challenge. I think something really valuable from this book too is how he breaks things down to component pieces. So he talks about trying to get the world pull-up record. I mean, it sounds like fiction with all the different things he overcomes and all the different challenges he puts in front of himself. For the pull-up record, he's like, okay, what is it? Okay, like 4,000 pull-ups in a day. I can do that. That's just 6 every minute on the minute for 17 hours. And just taking that same mindset of, okay, here's an impossible task, but what does it actually look like in the smallest possible piece? And all of a sudden it sounds manageable. There's a lot of useful...
Not even one pull-up a second.
Exactly. Like I can do six pull-ups a minute sounds easy. I mean, extending it out for 17 hours is a little different.
Recently, he called out, do you know who Cameron Hanes is?
I don't.
He's a friend of David Goggins and of Joe Rogan. He runs a marathon a day. He has a son named Truett, and David Goggins called him out and told him to beat him at the pull-up challenge. So Truett is currently training to try and beat.
Well, David Goggins doesn't have the pull-up
Goggins
record anymore. Anyway.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's not built for the pull-up record, and that's what's so interesting is his natural build didn't lend himself to be skilled at any of these things. If anything, his natural build was probably to be a powerlifter. I mean, he's a big boned kind of dude, not built to be a runner, not built to be a pull-up guy. Like you should kind of want to be a stringy guy with shorter arms because that makes pull-ups easier. Whereas he's like a big dude, lots of weight carrying around, trying to put all that pressure on your hands. But that's David Goggins. He's one of the most motivational, incredible reads I've ever read.
And you listen to the audiobook, right?
Twice.
Yeah.
Full length. Within like 2 months of the first time I listened to it again. Maybe listen to it again. It's that good. I'll listen to it a third time. Let's get David on the show. The problem with David Goggins is if you let him into your life, and that's the problem with Tim Ferriss too. These people make you question. They force you to be better because they expose you to how much better you could be. And it kind of pisses you off that you're not doing what they do. Like David Goggins, he would be like, okay, but I need to see you run through this brick wall without any equipment first. I'm like, what do you mean run through the brick wall? And he'd be like, once I see you break through this wall with just your body, that's when I'll talk to you. So that's pretty cool. What you got, Kyle?
I think that's an awesome story and an awesome guy, Lewis. I think that the next one that I'll talk about is 0 to 1. And I'll be honest, I read this a long time ago. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to remember everything. But the lesson that I took away from it is the power of a monopoly and the fact that monopolies are still real. One of the points he makes is that Google, Facebook, Amazon, they're all monopolies. Google is a monopoly on search, right? Mm-hmm. But they mask that by saying that they're a technology company.
Yeah.
So 95% of the revenue comes from AdWords, like search. And the whole book is about how if you can control, you either create something new or you reiterate. If you reiterate, it has to be at least an order of magnitude better than the last version of it in order for you to have a monopoly. And a monopoly is having control of a market, but it's also, you get there by creating something new. So that's where the title comes into play. He says that most companies go from 1 to N, meaning they're iterating on some other business model, some other design in a not very meaningful way, but a way that will produce profits. So what he wants to see and what he encourages is for people to go from 0 to 1, where you are inventing a market like Uber did or Airbnb or, you know, it's the things that
Did Uber and Airbnb, are those 0 to 1 or are those iterating on something in an order of magnitude new way? I don't know.
0 to 1 is companies that reiterate to an order of magnitude.
Okay.
But it's more about like creating the market, and that's sure. What Airbnb did. Yeah, that's pretty much all I've got about 0 to 1. Peter Thiel's a really, really interesting guy.
Okay. I don't really have a choice for my last book here. One good one I'll talk about and just choose to make it my fifth, and then the rest I'll just read as honorable mentions at the end, is Hybrid of Atomic Habits and Power of Habit. Atomic Habits is, in summary, an updated version of Power of Habit. It's going into making you self-aware of the importance of habits and how much power they actually have over your life. The unconscious behaviors that you go into in a routine, automatic way that control so much more of your behavior in your daily life than you think until you're made aware of it. There's so much to unpack with all these ideas that it's hard to encapsulate them into brief book summaries. But if you think about, I guess, applying it from a improving your life point of view, habits are the most easy way to make lasting change with the least amount of effort. What are habits? How do you change a habit? How do you introduce a new habit? Each one of those is its own point of conversation. The books are really useful for learning what habits are, which then empowers you to be able to change existing habits or introduce new habits.
One big takeaway for me from The Power of Habit was the idea of keystone habits. When you make a grand gesture or a big change, it's like when you move to a new city and you are able to build your habits off of that. Like that would be a keystone moment where you can rebuild your habits. Coming out of the quarantine will be a keystone moment for a lot of people where you get to reinvent yourself and your habits, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe that's wrong. Maybe that's right. We'll see afterward.
We're going to be gentle with using the label keystone habits there, but the concept you described is still interesting and useful. Those are all my 5 books, Kyle. I think you got one left.
I think I have
Uncle
one
Benji
left.
Or a different one.
Yeah, we can do that one.
Okay.
The Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin is one that I have read most of recently, and it walks through his time as a kid and then going to Philadelphia. Crazy story about him almost dying, but because he was so curious, he had read a book about fevers, so he knew that if he drank enough cold water that he'd be fine. Meanwhile, like most of the other people on that ship got really sick. What drew me to it was just the character of Ben Franklin in retrospect is unbelievable. I mean, this guy invented bifocals. He pretty much created America. He's the only person
created bifocals first, America second.
He's the only person that signed the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Treaty of Versailles.
Sounds like he just likes taking credit for things.
Yeah, but also we see all of his big accomplishments, and this book was very interesting because it broke down the way that he thinks about things, his emphasis on virtue. He wanted to be a very good person. So what he did was he created a table with 13 different characteristics of someone with virtue. And then each week he would track one of those different characteristics. So let's say on days that he lacked honesty, he would put an X on it, and he would cycle through all of these different 13 virtues until he saw himself improving. And I think that it's certainly interesting for us to see his accomplishments and then to also see this other layer beneath it where he put so much emphasis and focus on actually being a better person.
I think that's a really interesting contrast to some of these other people that we've talked about, right? Because you have the people like Phil Knight that just kind of seem like they blustered into mega success. And you have someone like Ben Franklin, who he's extremely calculated and extremely intentional about, this is how I shall approach my life in order to get the things I want out of it. Like, I'm going to keep a notebook of my virtues and make sure I'm virtuous. Whereas some of these other people are just, okay, I'm just going to do the next action. I'm just going to do the next thing. I'm just going to figure out the next thing.
Yeah.
Which strategy do you think is more anti-fragile?
Between Phil Knight and Ben Franklin?
Yeah, because they kind of represent two extremes of like the self-obsessive manic Ben Franklin and the Phil Knight who just kind of show up to work, figure out today's set of problems.
I think they're both very anti-fragile. Ben Franklin could have benefited from anything.
He'd spin anything, any adversity as something in his own favor.
Exactly. And he did. I mean, we watched him do that through that book. Right?
I think something, exactly. Very interesting about Ben Franklin is he espoused a very simple doctrine. Be humble, do good work, be a tradesman, be a craftsman, go to work hard, like, he wasn't basically saying in a kind of Tim Ferrissian way, you need to be the self-obsessive guy.
He wasn't reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, but I'm saying he kind of preached somewhat slightly different than he practiced. Like, he didn't say everyone should do this virtue practice for themselves.
for sure.
I think I'm going to list out quickly a rapid fire Lewis's honorable mentions, and you can do the same, and we can wrap this up. My honorable mentions: Unscripted by MJ DeMarco. It's another book about entrepreneurship. He is another evangelist for the possibilities of entrepreneurship, brings up and conceptualizes in really interesting ways the importance of divorcing your time from money and the leverage entrepreneurship gives you. Principles by Dalio. One of the most interesting takeaways from that book is using hard times as a cue for learning, being very introspective and cataloging all of your major life experiences to make sure that you know how to respond to situations and you can recognize patterns in your own history, but also in world history, and catalog those principles, the underlying truths that tend to govern the situations, so you can be aware of them and use them to your advantage. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, that's a classic. I didn't really feel as qualified to talk about it because, I mean, I've read it, but that book takes some chewing. You really got to chew and digest that book too. I mean, Ryan Holiday, an author, he claims to have read it over 100 times, and he still acts like things in there are new and interesting to him. It's just a great book to serve as a devotional, like we talked about, where you read a little bit of it every day, of just some ancient wisdom that's perfectly applicable today. Same for Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, the younger, pretty sure. Stoic text, Roman philosophers, great stuff. Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. I like that book because it's very important. One, his playful experimental spirit towards learning, but also his emphasis on what it means to really understand something and being a higher quality learner. The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, key takeaway from that book. All real measurements are internal. It's a story of Howard Rourke and how he's the only person that determines whether or not his work is valuable or not. And I think that's very interesting. Finally, Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, also a fantastic book, written in, like, I'm going to say the 80s, about the consequences of the rise in television culture and the flaws in media consumption. And that book's a great partner read for the information diet type discussion from the 4-Hour Workweek. So that's my bonus list. Or just look at my Goodreads.
Bonus list will be much shorter. The first one is the Leonardo Da Vinci Biography by Walter Isaacson. It's just really fascinating to see that level of curiosity in any human. And it was really interesting to learn that he only published like one thing in his whole life, and it wasn't even his thing. It was his friend's math book. We talked about that in a past podcast with Lisa McKinney, but I just really that challenging assumptions the thing. Like, you know, we've all heard of Leonardo da Vinci, but it turns out he's way different than I would have ever expected. And then one that I have right here that's speaking to me is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I know that most everybody reads it in high school, and there's a bunch of debates about it. But I'm from Alabama, and I pass where she lived probably like once a year. And To Kill a Mockingbird, to me, is about not judging, you know, books by their covers or people by stories, and giving people the benefit of the doubt.
Let's quickly recap the titles we talked about. I'll do my list, you'll do yours, and then we'll wrap things up. I listed Deep Work by Cal Newport, great productivity book. 4-Hour Workweek by Timothy Ferriss, great productivity, entrepreneurship, lifestyle design book. Antifragile, I'm going to call that philosophy, economics. It's a book that makes you think. Cant Hurt Me by David Goggins, autobiography/biography about a Navy SEAL. Atomic Habits or The Power of Habit, Atomic Habits being by James Clear, Power of Habit being by Charles Duhigg, books about, believe it or not, habits. And the honorable mentions I just said.
I mentioned Equity Happens by Robert Helms and Russell Gray. Also, the Real Estate Guys radio show is where you can find them. I talked about 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. And I talked about Shoe Dog by Phil Knight.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for listening. If you liked this episode, please leave a rating on iTunes or a review. Leave a comment if you have feedback. If you like this kind of content, if you prefer more interviews, if there's something you'd like us to go in greater detail on, we'd be happy to do it. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you.